Michelle. Wow, great to be here. I've done Coffee at 10 a couple times before in different alliterations, so it's good. So hopefully you're not being tired of me. Yeah, Christy asked me to talk about times two for a minute, and I'll just talk about it for a minute. It was a really fun show to jury. Whenever there's kind of, I'll say, for lack of a better term, found object sort of recycling, sort of repurposing shows, it can go a lot of different directions, and it does. And I was just like so impressed by the quality of the work that, because a lot of times we can kind of like just like, well, this is a cool looking rusty piece of metal, I'll just like screw it onto a board and call it art. Everybody just like really worked it and turned it into something of their own. And I suppose that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today as we talk about influences, okay? And how art influences those of us that are artists in the room, and I know there's a few of you, maybe all of you, consider yourself artists, that as we're influenced by other artists, things bubble up in us and we make it our own. Okay, so are we ready? We're going to save questions for later. I was going to say, do you have any questions? But too early for that. Okay. Thank you to Michelle for like, I like this idea of art history's great influencers. That, you know, it's just so sort of influencing is trending right now in social medias, and that everybody's about the influencers and Taylor Swifts of the world and that sort of thing. And so it makes sense when we talk about artists and how artists look back into history. And so I want to talk about art history for just a second, because that's who we're influenced by typically. We haven't been influenced by the people that haven't created any art yet. Okay, so art history, why would we even consider it? And what is it? If we break it down to art and history, we can kind of have it in some bite-sized pieces. When I was a kid, history was just a dusty old subject that didn't hold much interest to me at all. And so history class just, but at some point I found out that my grandfather, who I was named after, had a huge part of the history of Southwest America, particularly Northern Arizona. He worked with Babbitt Brothers, the Indian traders, and they had trading posts in Tuba City and Cedar Ridge and that sort of thing. Anyway, you're going to ask, where the heck is he going with this? But once I knew that, and he actually died on the last crossing of Lee's Ferry across the Colorado River at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, just before they put in Glen Canyon and all that sort of, or I guess it's north of the Grand Canyon, but before they put the dam in and the bridge, you could only cross at Lee's Ferry at this point. And he died in that with the ferryman and his Navajo companion. And all of a sudden I found out, and I still keep finding out about people that know this story, is in fact, a student I had, her name is just outside of my memory. She's a biologist. She worked at the Grand Canyon, and she knew all about that. And she was telling me about the biology. She's a biologist, all about the biology of the ecosystem. But when I talked about that, she goes, "Oh yeah, I know all about that. I've been there lots of times." And so if you read a history book that says anything about Lee's Ferry, you'll see my name. And so what I'm getting at, because this has nothing to do with art at all, but as we have a point of connection or engagement with something, all of a sudden a new subject can be very, very interesting. And then history became interesting to me once I was told, and I kind of grew up to mid-adolescence to understand that was a point in history that not just for our family, but everybody kind of, you guys know about it now, even about them. But anyway, history became interesting. All right. Art, on the other hand, for me, was quite a different story. most of the art that I was exposed to as a kid was in books or at the Art Institute of Chicago. And so as you looked at that, especially as a small kid, all art was old. It was created in a time frame that, you know, didn't exist anymore. In fact, I was so sort of naive to think that art's probably not even being created anymore. It's just, you know, it's just great to be able to go see what somebody managed to save. And so as I would go and look at these, they were historical documents to me. They were worlds that I could explore. It was fascinating, so different from history in school. And so it bubbled up in me so many sort of questions about each piece in the museum. Like, what is this painting about? Who painted it? When did he paint it? How did he paint it? All those sort of things I was curious about. I suppose even as a young kid, I was really fascinated by process, whether it's how a car is put together or a tree grows or how you paint a picture or the order in which things need to happen to make something happen like that. And so how did they do it? And as I got a little bit older, I was like, I could start drawing comparisons between different artists. It's like, who inspired who? Like, what were the influences? And I think very often in our history, that's super helpful for us to look at the influences that artists had. And so we know about through art history, there's several, like, we'll call them duos of artists that influenced each other while they were living. For example, Van Gogh and Gauguin, they knew each other. They actually lived with each other for a short while, but they influenced each other because they worked side by side. They admired each other's work. Monet and Manet, kind of a friendly back and forth there. But they influenced each other. They helped each other. They communicated with each other. Monet and Mary Cassatt as well. They knew each other. They socialized together. And so there was some cross-pollination there. They can't help but be influences when you have great creative people in the same room, whether they admit it or not. Okay, and so today I want to discuss two artists. And they came from different eras, although oddly enough, their lifetimes did overlap by some 30 some years. Okay. Diebenkorn, let me go, you see the name up here, who is Richard Diebenkorn. He was a San Francisco Bay artist, and I'll just put that there. He was well on his way to being a fully formed artist when he first learned about Matisse. And so I think everybody knows the name Matisse, right? And you're probably familiar with a lot of his work. The great thing about Henri Matisse is that he lived so long that he was able to, like, invent himself and reinvent himself. And so we have lots of different, like, bodies of work from Matisse that are some pretty wildly different as he worked as a painter, a printmaker, and a sculptor. And so what I want to do is look at his work for a little bit and get to know it a little bit better by looking at who influenced him. We'll take a look at that, and maybe there will be some surprises for us. And then I introduce Richard Diebenkorn a little bit more by looking at how he was influenced by Matisse, if that makes any sense. All right. Matisse was born in 1869 and died in just before my lifetime in 1954. And Richard Diebenkorn, of course, you can see the overlap there in time frames. All right. Matisse was born in France. He was born actually on New Year's Eve, 1869. He was born Henri Emile Benoit Matisse, or we just refer to him as Matisse. Um, and then he died in 1954 at 84 years old. We could spend more than this whole time just talking about Matisse and all of the stuff that he did in his life, and we could do the same with Diebenkorn, but the time we have here, we're going to take this sort of influential direction here. So there'll just be a little bit about his life. Matisse was born the son of a successful grain merchant, and his father wanted him to be an attorney. And as we study that sort of that time frame, it's amazing how many fathers wanted their sons to be a lawyer or an attorney. Some of them were themselves, and of course, then their child disappointed them. And so Matisse went to school. He said, "Okay, Dad, I will do it." He went through the law school thing, and he was kind of a law clerk, and then he got appendicitis, and he had to come back home. He was like laid up in bed for months in his recovery, and his mother, in her infinite wisdom and caring for him, thought, you know what, you need something to do while you're just laying there in bed. And so she bought him a paint set and presented it to him, and he started drawing and painting while he was convalescing. And when he got better, he said, "I am not going back to do that." And he went to Paris and went to art school, and it all changed. And so that's when his being influenced by other artists started, because I don't think he'd given a whole lot of thought to art beforehand. And so here's our friend Matisse and with a model, and one of his paintings of the style that we're pretty familiar with from when he was living in Nice. But I wanted to show this just to show him as a man, as a painter in a space, so that, because so often when we talk about these great artists that we just talk about, we refer to them just as Matisse, they kind of become these supernatural, mystical beings, but actually there's a picture of them, all right? Okay. This is a study that Matisse did in the studio of Gustave Moreau, one of his instructors, and we can see whether or not he had an interest in the figure, or maybe this is where it started, that he was from a very early part of his career as an artist working with the figure, which was a standard sort of, and still is a standard thing in our study as we learn proportion and anatomy and that sort of thing. Drawing the figure is just a part of our art education. He was also, as I said, he was lived a long time, so he was part of lots of different art movements. One of the more famous ones that was rather short-lived is the Fauvist movement. Fauve, or the Fauvists, in French, that means wild beasts. And they were named that just because of their completely non-localized color. It was just crazy, crazy colors. We have green faces and all that sort of thing. And so he was part of that movement that with Andre Durain and a few other artists, but he was there. And then he was, of course, he influenced and worked as an impressionist a little bit, in post-impressionism and neo-impressionism. And we can see, as we look at some of his influences coming up here, that he's probably influenced, even in this piece, by Cézanne and his bathers, and Poussin and his historical paintings. Directly, pretty much looking at Cézanne and seeing the subject, even treating the figure very similarly with the black outlines. That's what we see here. And of course, many artists were impressed and influenced by Cézanne, as was Picasso, who was paralleling Matisse his whole career. And they kind of had this friendly sort of competition as to who was the greatest modern painter. Although they got along just fine, they still remain as being these two artists that lived a long time and thus became rather uncategorical as far as artists. We don't say like Monet was an impressionist. You know, these guys like spanned so much time. So Cezanne also influenced his still lives. Well, can you admit, Mario? And so we can see in some of his brushworks in this still life here, the piece on the left that Matisse did of his looking at the chiseled brushstrokes of Cezanne. There we go. And here is another one here on this wall here. We can see it even more. Those sort of like sharp sort of brush strokes. And again, the idea of still life, which is not a new thing or unique to Cezanne or Matisse, but it was something that he could sit back and do without like getting a model or going outside. He could set it up in his studio. And I suppose that's why a lot of us do that. Paul Gauguin was another one that influenced him. This Luxembourg Gardens here from 1901 is a painting that obviously he's still in that sort of Fauvist movement, which, you know, wasn't a stretch to be looking at Gauguin. Gauguin was in his own world, but we can kind of see some of those fantastical sort of botanical shapes that Gauguin has, and of course the colors were impressive to Matisse. Another Gauguin, and kind of an outlier for Matisse, this one figurative piece of Carmelita, a great figurative painting, but we don't see too many things in his body of work that looks anything like it. But then all of a sudden we look back and we see, was he looking at Gauguin for this sort of like in your face sort of composition and representation of the figure? Maybe. I propose that maybe that was the case. Paul Signac is another one. In his Signac and Seurat were the pointillists of the time. Again, yet another movement that Matisse was dipping his toe into. And so we can see that there, and we can see some similarities here going back to this painting here. As we look at some of the outliney sort of ways that he handled these figures, we kind of see some of that happening here in this painting. Of Signac, if we look really close, it's hard to see in that, but there are these like subtle outlines that kind of really echo what was happening in that other painting. Of course, Van Gogh did influence him, and he was introduced to Van Gogh by John Russell, an Australian painter, who they got to be friends, and I'm not sure exactly what they did together, but Van Gogh was in Paris at the time when John Russell had just come from Australia. They were in a painting studio together, and this actually is the first portrait painted of Van Gogh by John Russell. Anyway, they became friends, Russell and Matisse. In fact, he even presented Matisse with a drawing of Van Gogh. And so here we have the green line or the green stripe, a painting of Amélie, Matisse, and it's done in the Fauvist sort of style, but portraiture, figuration, still life, interiors, and landscapes are all things that we're seeing here from Matisse. I wanted to show these paintings again. They're an influence probably a little bit through the bathers of Cezanne, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the way that Matisse worked and how he was trying and striving to be original in every alliteration of a painting. And so we can see subtle differences. It wasn't like he was taking this Lelux and projecting it onto another canvas. He was redrawing. We see subtle changes in it as it gets refined and appears as number 2. And then it almost looks like he's like, okay, that was fun, but I'm going to take the same characters here and just kind of like make them do something else and put a turtle in here. And so I see these as kind of a continued series, and there's a series of Matisse's work where there's musicians and boys playing bowls and lawn bowls and that sort of thing. It's all kind of morphs around this sort of idea of figures in the landscape, but then just like building on what the painting gave him prior to. Okay, let's look at Richard Diebenkorn. He's the one I'm sure you're dying to know more about. How many people here are at least know the name? Oh, good. Well, here he is kind of a young man with a blurry profile of his wife, Phyllis. And this is Phyllis on the couch, being the sleeping woman, probably saying, I am this tired enough of posing for you that I'm just going to lay my head down here. She's almost every one of the not all of the figures, but we start to recognize Phyllis in Diebenkorn's paintings. This painting in particular, you can see in Michigan. It's in Kalamazoo at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. And so I suggest if you're downstate that you go and see it. It's an absolutely beautiful piece that, again, as we start thinking back on Matisse and his interiors and his figurative work, this is not a huge step left or right. All right. Diebenkorn was known primarily as an abstract painter. And it wasn't until a little bit later in his life that he broke away from this abstract movement, which was out in California, was kind of a different thing than what was happening in New York, but it was certainly influenced by the abstract expressionists in New York. You know, the art world kind of did the same thing that the music world did, you know? In New York, we had the punk rockers, the sort of Lou Reed sort of guys of the world. And then we have Jefferson Airplane in San Francisco, this sort of hippy dippy psychedelic music. And so they're both like breaking traditions of traditional sort of Perry Como, Frank Sinatra sort of music and making something brand new. And people didn't always know how to take it. Anyway, Diebenkorn was working as an abstract artist at Stanford when he was there. It's the only way that you could paint. They would not allow you to paint representationally. It just was not part of the program. And so that's how he was brought up. And while he was at Stanford, he was invited by his professor to visit the home of Sarah Stein, who was the sister-in-law of Gertrude Stein. And she had like lived in Paris and was collecting art just like Gertrude Stein was. And she had all these original paintings. I don't know, I think she owned like 50 paintings of these. Anyway, so he went there for a luncheon and was just like, whoa. He couldn't believe it. And so his interest in Matisse started then. And so here we look at one of my favorite paintings from Matisse, the Goldfish and Palette. And then we look at the abstract Urbana 6, which is probably not, the question comes up. Let me put it this way. The question arises, was Diebenkorn just copying Matisse? And I think it's pretty obviously he wasn't copying it, but there's some sensibilities, there's some coloration, there's some balance and a lot of composition that he's being influenced by here, and we just see it in his work over and over again. And a lot of times he's tipping things at 90 degrees as things that might be vertical in Matisse's work suddenly are horizontal in his work. But there's loopy little wrought iron balustrades. There's loopy little figurative sort of things that we almost can tell what they are, but they're not. This is Urbana 6. Diebenkorn numbered his work and pretty much named them after the city that he was in while he was painting them. And this was kind of a dark period for Diebenkorn. After he got out of the Marines and he got a teaching position at University of Illinois and in Urbana, and he kind of didn't like it there. He's used to being near the ocean, near mountains, and he was in this dusty, flat farmland with corn. And he didn't love it and didn't stay there very long. And so he just blacked out his windows in his studio in Urbana and worked without being distracted by what he thought wasn't that beautiful outside. All right. Does anybody see any sort of like sensibilities being borrowed here? A little bit? Okay. Let's look at some. Yeah, I'm trying to, there we go. Okay. This Berkeley 5 on this side, of course, is from Berkeley, California. And here we see this landscape from Matisse, which is starting to like really break away from what we would say is representationalism. He's taking some liberties here. And we might see some sort of influences from Matisse, from Van Gogh. There's these big juicy brush strokes that they weren't so juicy in Cézanne's work, but in Van Gogh's they were. Okay. Here's another one of my favorite Matisse paintings from his studio in Paris. And here we can see he's kept things kind of in the same realm, that red couch, and we see this red bar across there and the divisions of this composition. And we get a sense, even in Diebenkorn's abstract painting here, a sense of near and far, this grayish thing that's in that yellow field. I don't know, it could be read as a table that it's near, and then what's beyond that red band seems like it's far away. And I think that's beautiful when an abstract piece can give us more than just like splashes of color, when there's a sense of depth, even when we can't recognize what it is, whether it's a table, a floor, or a bed, or a person. It doesn't matter, but it gives us that sensation. So again, here, there's some things that you might say he might have actually been looking at this painting. This was a really important painting for him when Diebenkorn saw this painting by Matisse. And here, as we look at Urbana 5, you know, the edge of that curtain coming across that door, that big diagonal, which is interesting on that sort of like really thin gossamer sort of curtain. I'm imagining that it was kind of sheer, that he put that dark diagonal line in there. And it's such an important part of the composition in the Matisse piece. And then we find it here in Urbana 5, also like supporting the whole piece. And then there's this sort of looks like a bent figure over here on the right with where that vertical comes through. I like to think of composition, whether it's abstract or in representational work, in very constructionist sort of terms. And we all know that if you build a square out of 2x4s, you can wiggle it around a lot. But as soon as you put an angle piece, even just from the top to the side, it tightens it up so much that it will stay square. And when we see those diagonal lines in an abstract piece, it just like holds it together. A lot of times, if we took that out, maybe all the pieces would fall down and we just have a white canvas again. Maybe. Diebenkorn didn't do a lot of plein air work, but he did this, and it's maybe they were just like twins in a different era. I'm not sure. I can't imagine that Diebenkorn saw all of his work or like looked at it, but boy, just the way it's divided top to bottom, just the way this building is handled, and the way the main building structure is handled in Diebenkorn's piece. It's they either were still communicating beyond the veil of whatever, or he was influenced by him and saw this and wanted to see how he did it. A lot of times as artists, we will look at somebody and say, how did he do that? The only way I can figure out how to do it is to try and paint it. Again, still life, just like our friend Matisse was influenced by Cézanne, Diebenkorn was, I think, very influenced by Matisse. I love that this one is lemons. Very often there's oranges. I love that Diebenkorn like did orange peels. Again, it just makes this sort of like on this abstract sort of shape, but as we understand it's an orange peel, it does make sense. But if you're just trying, you can identify everything. If you didn't see the title, you might not know just what that was. The strong patterns, we have stripes, we have these floral things that are happening, this pattern in the back of Matisse's work with these sort of muted tones, either on the table or the background. The one thing that we find out, that we can notice is that Matisse very often had these very big, colorful displays of pattern. In fact, he was kind of chided for that and say, oh, well, his painting would make a great necktie or whatever. And so we see a lot of this complicated backgrounds and tapestries and fabrics in Matisse's work, where in his interiors, where in Diebenkorn's is actually pretty stark. And so as much as they were the same, sometimes he was doing the exact opposite sort of thing. Here again is a great example of one of those paintings where he took the idea and turned it 90 degrees. We have these really interesting verticals in the Matisse piece with this very obvious centered pottery. And then over here in the Diebenkorn piece, it's all kind of turned on its side. Yet, down here in this bottom stripe, there is something that kind of a coffee cup, or a vessel, definitely. And so, is it a still life? I don't know. Was it meant to be a coffee cup? Was it meant to be something else? Is it a landscape? You know? It's Berkeley 47 is what it is. This also was one of the pieces that Diebenkorn saw of Matisse that just really impressed him. And again, it's other than the blue color, those verticals just kind of hit in the same places in the composition. I think it's a place where they were communicating yet again. After I said that about the complicated and simple backgrounds, here, of course, I'm showing you a Matisse with just a plain black background and a really interesting setting, looking out a window while Phyllis is drinking a cup of coffee. Very often, Phyllis is seen drinking a cup of coffee. Either she had a real caffeine addiction, or he just liked that shape and made her hold these coffee cups. But here again, we see, the seated figure in very much sort of pensive, relaxed, eyes closed, kind of enjoying the situation. You look at that and you go, she's not like burning her mouth. She is like enjoying that cup of coffee. Like, and she just got done drinking a cup of coffee. Although you should think of coffee not like putting you to sleep. Maybe she was drinking something else. But there's this she's not in trouble. Let's put it that way. She's not feeling any anxiety. She is just enjoying it. Okay, here we do see an elaborate sort of interior from Matisse. Again, this idea that we see over and over again in both of their works, where we're inhabiting a space, we're inside, and we're looking through into another room. In the Matisse piece, we're looking into another room and then looking out the window. Here, Diebenkorn he's still holding on to some of those abstract concepts, and is just giving us this rectangle of blue that's divided up in a couple different hues, and instead of the depth of that, but we get the sense of here and there again, just like we were seeing in that abstract piece a little bit earlier. Again, this idea of being inside and looking outside. A piece from Matisse from Nice. I never thought of that. Once he moved to Matisse, once he moved to Nice, he was Matisse from Nice. And then we're looking out across the street. And whenever I look at this, I think of like standing in the front yard of the old art building in Leland and looking at Van's garage. It looks like a garage across the street. And so this is part of the stuff too that I think is fascinating about art as we think about art history, the things that we can kind of like observe, pick up, learn about a culture or a location or different places in the world. We can kind of learn things about them through the paintings. One thing I want to point out about the painting on the left, not everybody knows it. Matisse did play the violin. In fact, he played it every day. He wasn't a performing musician, but he played the violin every day. In fact, their family was rather musical, and we'll get to the piano lesson painting here. But here again, really, really wildly different sort of things. But I certainly see a comparison, even if you just said, well, the woman's the same color as that wall, but there's something about the Diebenkorn painting that seems as relaxed as this large reclining nude from 1935. And we see, is this railing answer to Matisse's studio paintings, many of which have that sort of wrought iron thing, but we also see it in the plant that's next to this figure here in whatever those curly hue things are, leaves, ferns. But there's a structure too in the patterns that's happening in the Matisse piece that we see in the structure of the architecture in this painting called Window. Another still life. I think that they were looking, or Diebenkorn was paying attention to the proportions of where things go from left to right, top to bottom, a lot as he was looking at Matisse. This painting on the left from Matisse is painted looking the other direction from that one with the figure where we're looking across the Seine. Well, we're still looking at the Seine here, but we're looking at Notre Dame, looking the other direction. And so we have this composition that it starts bending towards abstract. And we're going to see another version of this by Matisse that is a lot more abstract, but we can see this bend where the people walking down the right side of the river with the compositional bend of the bridge going over the river and leading us back to the Notre Dame Cathedral. It's really, with all of its angles, is very fluid and just moves us back through. And then we look at Ingleside, which, by the way, is another painting we can enjoy in Michigan. You can see this at the Graham in Grand Rapids. Worth the trip just to go see this museum, or just to go see this painting in the museum. You saw nothing else in the museum but this painting. And so here we have the road, this suburban sort of road that's curving around, giving us the same sort of fluid movement through this neighborhood with some interesting little characters that are trees instead of pedestrians. But then when we look at those hillsides, the neighborhoods that are going up over the hill, if they're not mirroring those towers of Notre Dame, I don't know what they are, but I'd love to see how this is doing that. This and that, this and that. Okay, one of the things that I think it was in '67, Diebenkorn was invited, because at this point he was probably the foremost West Coast abstract painter. He was on this culture exchange and went to Russia and saw all of these great Matisse paintings that nobody else had seen, because nobody else had gone over there to see them. But we knew that they were there because Matisse had, his name escapes me, a Russian patron that bought lots and lots of his work. But this piece was particularly fascinating to him, and we see the use of patterns here that we don't see a lot of in Diebenkorn's work, but this is kind of a direct response as we look at the title, Recollections of a Visit to Leningrad. I said 65, so maybe that was maybe either that date is wrong or I was wrong about the 67 thing. But here again, we are inside looking out. And as we look at the one on the left, we can tell also a name that I left off, but I'm reminded of it when I look at the painting here by Diebenkorn, that he was a huge Edward Hopper fan. And so we see a lot of that with Hopper, where there's an interior space and a fascinating space outside. When Diebenkorn moved back to California after being in Urbana, he hooked up with a couple other artists. I'll name two of them right now. David Park and Elmer Bischoff. And there's another one that's right on the tip of my tongue. But they had a little figure drawing group that they met every week for years and years and years. And so this is actually like really fed his interest in the figure and representationalism. And so he was working weekly with models, that sort of thing. But again, I maybe it's a stretch. It's not hard to imagine that if you go to a figure drawing session every week, models are going to start sort of repeating similar sort of poses. I mean, they just kind of do. So I can't say that this is a direct response, but it's interesting to see that they both were doing studies. This piece by Matisse is obviously a study, or just from working for the model. Again, although I got to think that this drawing by Diebenkorn was somehow influenced. It's just a little bit too similar to have the sort of pattern robe on both models. This is one where you might say, well, if I took the names off, you would be hard pressed to guess whose was whose. But they were both way more interested in what you felt from this, rather than the anatomical absolute correctness. But at the same time, we know exactly what they're doing, and we each could assume either one of those poses. They're not unrealistic sort of poses. When we look at some artists' work, you're like, okay, I see the pose, but there's no way that anybody could actually assume that pose. Whereas this is giving us a sense of real motion and weight and tension within the figure, and also being set in an interesting composition, both of them, as we look at what each artist put the figure against. Okay, the yellow dress, the yellow collage. You can probably start to recognize that's probably Phyllis Diebenkorn in the Diebenkorn painting. We've seen, and even now we've seen enough of them to know that that's probably her. And so this is, again, simplified abstraction, really involved sort of patterns and colors. The interesting thing here is all of a sudden we see Diebenkorn working in collage, which I think everybody realized that in Matisse's later years, when he wasn't painting anymore, he started to do what he called drawing with scissors and was doing collage. And so I love this painting of him in his wheelchair with his shears just cutting through this paper and making these delicious sort of collages. Yet another painting, which we're going to assume is Phyllis, and they're both portraits of their wives. Not in the same pose, but interesting to think about how they each handled faces. And this one is actually a much more developed face in the Matisse painting. And we see a little hint of it there in the Diebenkorn, but very often they're kind of like pushing back on the face and just kind of like thinking more about what the figure is doing in general. Because faces as artists compositionally are a little bit like arrows. You know, it's dangerous to put an arrow in a painting unless you really want everybody to look at what it's pointing at. And a face will do that. As soon as you put a face in, it's just like, oh, this dress or this jacket is beautiful and everything, but I keep getting jerked back up to the face, because faces, we want to look at them. Since we're babies, we want to. I was told that, you know, babies' faces. So again, here we see Matisse being, is he influenced by Diebenkorn or is Diebenkorn influenced by Matisse? But I love this painting by Matisse, that he's just kind of like letting it go just to the bare minimums. And we can tell exactly how that model is sitting there. We move over to Ocean Park number 6, which is once he moved to LA and was doing these Ocean Park paintings. This was kind of, well, this is number 6. It was an early one, as you can tell, before he had maybe gotten to the place where the Ocean Park paintings that we're kind of familiar with. But we see similar texture, similar palette here. And even there's very few horizontals at all in the Matisse piece. Oh, his name rhymes with lots of things. Okay, so the painting on the right is something that's a little bit more typical of the Ocean Park series. This is a little bit further down the road. But this painting on the terrace from 1912, which Matisse painted on one of his 2 trips to Morocco. And you can tell that he was really influenced by those trips to Morocco when you look at all the fabrics and that he brought back to his studio, and we see it over and over again. He was fascinated by the textiles that were there and the color and the patterns that they had. But at the same time, he didn't let go of what was truly important. And that's the abstract construction, the composition that holds it together. Again, that diagonal is something that actually keeps the figure from floating up off this stand, or maybe the stand floating up with her. It just like solidifies the composition. If you took that away, and it was just all blue, it would be a little wobbly, I'm here to say. And Matisse or Diebenkorn, I think, was thinking about his paintings like I do compositionally as these constructions, and those diagonal lines are really making this solid. So here again, we see very similar palette and the use of diagonals and verticals to create a really strong composition. We're going back again to Notre Dame. Look at this painting by Matisse, which is getting to be about as abstract as you can. But as we go back to the other one and think about it, we can see the walkway along the side, the bridge over the Seine, and Notre Dame, which in this case looks a lot like a window. You know, this could just be a wall in an apartment, and that's a high window we're looking out of here. And so, but what he's given Diebenkorn to work with is this abstract composition of geometry with these lovely layers of paint. And he's painting over diagonal lines here and leaving them. And again, we see that time and time again, where Diebenkorn will put a mark down and he'll either scrub it out or paint over it, but doesn't bother to make it go away completely, which adds to the depth and richness of his work. And so we see that in both of these. So the abstract nature of this is really crazy from Matisse. Mentioned that they were a musical family. This is his son Pierre at the piano with his metronome, and some of his father's artwork around him, as well as looking out the window to the garden. Okay. And again, we have this diagonal, whether that's a sense of light or part of a walkway going out in the garden, doesn't matter. We still have this diagonal sort of shape that's leaning and giving some tension to this space. We see it again here. He didn't follow quite the same palette, but and I don't know that. In fact, I would guess to say there was no correlation between this painting by Matisse and this Ocean Park 94. Some of you may have been in the class where we dissected this. This painting of the piano lesson a couple of years ago, and we were talking about this figure here on the above Pierre's head. What is that? Is that another room with somebody sitting in that room and it's far enough away that we don't need a lot of color? Or what is it? Because we know down here that we can recognize this sculpture by Matisse. I don't have a picture of that, but I do have a picture of this painting. And so this painting is what was hanging on the wall behind Pierre while he was practicing the piano. So I think I love that as we look at Matisse's work, we can kind of tell what else he was working on or had just finished by looking at paintings in his studio, and we see his work on the wall, or in his home, we see other paintings. You can kind of tell which ones came first. We know that this painting came before the piano lesson. It's this kind of thing. And we're getting down to it, I think. I don't know what time it is, but here is a painting on the left by Matisse that is as abstract as anything that I've seen. In fact, it is almost like, is that the whole painting? Yes, that's the whole painting. But I have to think that when Diebenkorn saw this painting, and maybe he was working on Ocean Park series, maybe this is what kicked it off, but it's just pure geometry. As he thinks about like turning things on its ear a little bit, we have, again, not maybe direct correlation. It's like, oh, this is a copy of that painting, but we see a lot of those things, the hash marks in this blue-gray space we see these sort of hash marks that are happening in that sort of creamy color sort of space in the top of this Ocean Park painting. I definitely see a correlation here. And for someone back in 1914, who had worked through all these different things, and this was well before he was making collages. It's really cool to see him looking and painting like that. Here's another one. This I believe is the last slide. We've all seen this collage, this cutout by Matisse that shows those sort of philodendron, sort of ferny, sort of organic shapes. And I was unfamiliar with this piece until I was researching out what I was going to say about Diebenkorn and Matisse today. I found this painting and I said, wow, that is just like, again, really unlike a lot of his paintings and the shapes that we see in Diebenkorn's work. And I just had to wonder if some of that organic stuff was at all a response to what Matisse was doing. Let's see. Yes, that's it for that. That's all I'm going to say right now. And then just say, if anybody has any questions, I would love to see if I can answer them. Are there any questions? Yes.
It's not really a question, it's more of a comment. The progression of both artists through their work is kind of interesting. Matisse, when he started off, everything seems to be basically crudely represented, and his perspective was really very strange. A table would be maybe a 45-degree angle as opposed to a flat. And definitely the palettes between both artists was very similar in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the subject matter was too, even though there were different time spans in history. I think did a good job of presenting the two artists in so many years spread apart and often ages and the work they were doing. But it was an interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I should have mentioned, and maybe you noticed, the way I arranged the Diebenkorn part of the presentation was pretty much, I tried to lay those pieces, the Diebenkorn pieces out in chronological order, in the order that he painted them, because he could obviously pick and choose whichever sort of like era or painting or drawing that Matisse had done. I mean, he was constantly looking at them. He had probably up until that time, there's been some other books published since then, but I suspect that Diebenkorn had every possible book that you could ever get on Matisse. When he was in the Marines, he was stationed at in Virginia or something. Quantico? Where's Quantico? It's on the East Coast somewhere. But when he would have leave, he would go to Washington, D.C. and do the Phillips collection and Hirshhorn and all those sort of places. And then he would find his way to New York, and he was actually on a quest for Matisse, although, you know, he was influenced by other artists as well. But a lot of his students will say he quoted from Matisse way more than anybody. Diebenkorn was a kind of again, a trending term, kind of a fanboy of Matisse for sure. Any other questions? Sheila?
Okay. Enjoy the comparison of the sense of space. They both have the same lives, sense of large to small, overlapping and all that, but then they took geometry or something and just messed with it beyond your typical creating space. It's like they took the foreground up to the horizon line and messed with that part.
Right.
The geometry and tweaked it or it's something. And I think that's what even was maybe fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And I think like Cezanne, who also didn't seem to pay a whole lot of attention to perspective, yeah, as well. I think that those sort of things that we might, or we might not, other people might be critical of, add a certain tension to a composition. And we can tell, like that pink figure that was just kind of lines and like you couldn't actually make your arm quite bend like that, but we understood exactly what was happening and how the model was just kind of leaning. Gretchen.
Temporary artists that did.
That's a good question. I only look at dead artists. No. I don't know. Probably. Yeah, maybe. That would be an interesting study. But again, going back to the influences, it's fascinating to see through the ages who's influenced who over the years. And I think it's worth looking at. And I think that the best way, or not, maybe not the best way, there's a couple of good ways, but I think by comparing and contrasting people that we know have had influence and looking for those connections are a way that we can both start to dig into Diebenkorn's work, somebody that we're less familiar with, and at the same time, we can look deeper into Matisse's work, which you might just look at it and go, whoa, another pretty colorful, like involved tapestry of colors. But if we start looking at what somebody like Diebenkorn has pointed out to us, that there's some really great abstract compositional successes in Matisse's work, as much as some people might make fun of him as just kind of like pretty pictures with pretty colors and patterns in them, which some of his early critics said those sort of things. So. Sandy.
How many oceans?
There's like, I think I saw like up to 109. Like, yeah, there's a lot. And I have a lot more Diebenkorn research to do. But, yeah, no, he's fascinated me for a long time. The fact that what he does in the way he breaks up space and color, and when you see his work in person, it's really great. One other thing about both of these artists that, and I kind of alluded to it, but neither one of them hid their process. You know, I mean, the Impressionists changed things where we're looking at brushstrokes. By the way, these are brushstrokes. This is just paint on canvas, whereas prior to them in the Romantic era and that sort of thing, they didn't want to show brushstrokes. They would work till there were no brushstrokes typically. Whereas both of these artists like had no problem showing their process. When you look at their paintings, you can say, oh yeah, he just like scrubbed that whole blue field over a yellow one to cover up that line or whatever. But he didn't bother covering it up completely. And we see that in Matisse's work a lot too. There's no other questions or comments. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. So, you want more.